Welcome to the 6th lesson in the AQS Let's Quilt Beginner series, and our class is the Quilting with Triangles class. Well, today we have our quilt top all finished, and now we're ready to do some quilting. But before we do that, I want to remind you to be sure to register for the free prizes that our sponsors are providing as a part of this class. Some great prizes, and I'll tell you all about that before we end today. All right, so now let's talk about what do we need to do to quilt our quilt. Well, we need some materials, and so we need batting, we need thread, we need our quilt top, and we need a backing. And so the first thing I'm going to tell you is that this time I'm doing something slightly different. In the notes I told you there are 3 ways that you can make your quilt sandwich and baste it together. You can do it basting it by hand, you can use a spray glue, you can use safety pins, and you can use fusible batting. And this is a small enough project that it's a really good candidate for using the fusible. And the batting that I chose is Hobbs. They're cotton fusible heirloom batting. If you have batting, you need to be able to cut it. And so if you don't already have a pair of the Fomori Cutlery batting shears, you can see that they have a blunt tip on the tip of them so that you don't catch it in the batting. That's probably one of the hardest things about cutting batting is your scissors get caught in it. And so these are shaped so that you can slide it right along and cut and not catch the tip of those scissors. So if you don't have these, I'd add those to your arsenal of scissors. And then let's talk about thread. I've laid out 3 different colors of thread here. I've laid out the light color. This is like a light tan. And what I want to look at is how does it blend with all the different colors that I'm going to be sewing over. And you can see that there's a pretty high contrast on both the teal, the dark teal, and the blue. Yellow, it would blend in nicely, and of course it would blend in with the background. And then on this side I have a light gray, and part of it just depends on the look that you want. You can see that it will show up a little bit on the yellow, sort of blends into the darker colors, and it probably would show up a little bit on our background too. Well, the third color, I've already put it on the machine, so I just have a sample of it right here. But I chose a blue that's almost in this teal family. I thought that it doesn't show up very much on the yellow, and it doesn't show up very much on the background. And it blends pretty well with all the other colors I've used. So that's the one that I chose to put on the machine to do the quilting with. I decided I'm like you know, we're all beginners at something, and I'm not a very proficient free motion quilter. I like to play with that. So when I do my own quilting, a lot of times I will use a straight stitch where I can either use the dual feature like this machine has, the dual feed, or you can use your walking foot. And what both of those do is normally when your fabric goes through the machine, the feed dogs are feeding that, and whatever's on top kind of rides on top. And so when you have multiple layers like this, having the walking foot or the dual feed, it's helping to keep those fabrics all together so they go through the machine at the same time. So, all right, so now we have all our materials. Let's take just a word from our sponsors, and when we come back, I'm going to show you how we're going to put this quilt sandwich together.
Tracy's Tables has all of your custom sewing table needs. Visit tracystables.com to see the complete line of unique tables, carts, and shelves. And all of Tracy's Tables are made in the USA.
Okay, I'm ready to put my quilt sandwich together. And I've already done this part of it ahead of time. With this fusible batting, I'm going to lay the batting on my ironing board and lay the backing on top of that and press it. Now I will just tell you that you need to pay attention a little bit, because in some places you can see where there was a wrinkle in the batting. You want to make sure that you get those all pulled out. And what I do while I just have the batting there is, if you'll just hold your steam iron over that a little bit and pull it, and then it will lay nice and flat like it is right here. But you can see where there were some creases and it was kind of bubbled up in different parts of the batting. Okay, now I will tell you, one of the things that you'll find when you iron your backing to the batting is that this batting is fusible on both sides. So you'll find that it's going to stick to your ironing board. So I just do as wide as my ironing board is and move it and move to the next section and make sure I have it all spread out with my hands so that it's nice and smooth. And then when you get done, you just pull it up. It's still warm and it'll pull right up for you. And that won't affect the fusible that's on this side, because we need that part of it when we put the quilt top on. And so that's what we're going to do next. So I've pressed my top. The other thing I didn't say is that you want to cut your batting so it's at least 3 inches larger all the way around. So if this quilt is 36 inches finished, then we need to add at least 6 inches to that. All right, so I've pressed this really good, and I've pressed it really good from the top as well. And so now I'm going to center my quilt. Looks like I cut this one a little bigger than 3 inches bigger. Okay, so now I have my quilt all centered there, and I will begin to press my quilt. And so I still have and if you were at home, this would be a lot easier. I still have my wool pad underneath here to iron on. But I'm just going to take the iron, and we're just going to press. And of course, pressing on this is that you have to heat it up enough for that glue to stick to the back of your quilt. So this takes a little while. You just need to let the iron do the work. Now I'm going to show you just so you can see how it sticks, because if you don't like the way it ironed down at some point, all you have to do is pull it loose and it will come right up. So I'll press that back in place now. But you can see how easy it is to just pull it right up off of the batting. Now I'm going to move my quilt. I guess I'll move my ironing pad, but it might be easier. And continue pressing and pressing. Okay, I'm going to continue pressing this, and when we come back, after you hear a word from our sponsors, I'll be ready to show you how we're going to do some stitching in the ditch.
I'm Amanda Murphy, and I'm a quilt and pattern designer. The Bernina Q16 is quilting magic. One of the hallmarks of a great quilting experience is when you lose yourself in your work.
Bernina, made to create.
You know, it's never been proven, but we all know that the floor gets 2 inches farther away every year on your birthday. We can help you out with that. You need a design wall. Check us out at offthewallquilt.com.
Okay, I have it all pressed in place, and because you're going to be moving this around on your sewing machine, I put a few pins in, and I just put the pin in and don't hook it. And so I'm going to start in the corner, and actually the corner ones I will hook, and I'll just leave those in there. But the rest of them, so I'm going to come along the edge here and just put some pins that go all the way through and just let them sit just like that. Get over here to the other corner, and now I am going to hook that one. And now I'll come back and I'll go through and do the same thing on the rest of it. And I'm not going to be quilting in the middle of these pieces, so those are good candidates for us to stick a pin in just to secure it until we get our basting or our in the ditch stitching done. You see I have a thread here. This is a good time for you to check your threads as you're going over the top of this quilt, and so we'll get that trimmed off of there. Save you a lot of trouble when you get it all done from having to do that. All right, I do need to trim this down because I'm not going to want to work with this being quite this big. So now we're ready. You can see I've trimmed it all down, and I just laid the 6.5-inch ruler right on this seam line and trimmed it so it was pretty even all the way around. So that goes pretty quickly, but now you can see I got rid of a lot that I don't have to handle while I'm quilting. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do in the ditch quilting. And why do we do in the ditch quilting? It helps to stabilize your quilt for the rest of your quilting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the edge of the blocks where the two blocks come together, and I'm going to come all the way to here, both vertically, and then I'll do that same seam line going horizontally. And then I will come back and I will do right along our border edge. And then that will secure it. At that point, I can take all the pins out, and I'll take those pins out as I go, and we're ready to get started. The thread I'm using is a 50-weight thread. There are some people who prefer to even use a silk thread when they do their in the ditch quilting, because it really just disappears right down in that seam line. Usually silk is 100 weight, so you can see that would be a very thin thread. But the 50 weight or a 60 weight also works really well, and I'm using the 50 weight in the Coats & Clark cotton thread. So you can see that this isn't so big. I can just fold this over ever so slightly on the edge to get this all nice and neat. And on this machine, this little arm right here is the dual feed, which will help pull this through. If you were using a walking foot, you would have to change the feet. I'm using the same foot that I had on here before. I'm going to try to set my needle right down in that seam line right there. Okay, I'm ready to go. And now what I'm going to do is try to guide that so that I'm stitching right along this seam right here. And I will tell you, one of the things that you'll see when you do this kind of stitching, you'll see where your seams don't come together just perfectly, like right there. But hopefully by the time we get the quilting in there, you won't be so noticeable. Now, one of the things I found that as you get to where we have a lot of seams going together, you're going to probably want to slow down there a little bit, and you just keep going. So all I'm doing now is trying to guide it to make sure that I stay right in that seam line. And you can feel, once you've got this all pressed, you can see how flat that is right here. That's the way you want to keep it as you feed it into your machine, so you don't get any pleats on the back. And you'll want to reposition your hands as often as you need to. Some people like to use the machinger gloves. Some people like to use the ends of a pair of rubber gloves on their fingers. I sort of like the feel of being able to feel it myself. Now I'm at the end of that line of stitching, and you can do one of two things. You can either leave your threads long enough that you can bury them, but on a quilt like this where I have a lot of different print in the fabric, I usually just take 2 or 3 back stitches and then trim my threads. Now I can reach under here and get the bottom thread. And because these are curved, you can be pretty confident that you can just go in there and clip that right next to the fabric and not cut your fabric. All right, so now I have some pins I can get rid of down the middle of that. And now we're going to turn it around and we're going to go the other direction. Oh, and if you get a pin caught in your foot, then you know it's time to take it out. Here's the beginning of the block. And again, I'm going to set my needle down right in that seam line. Going to back stitch again. Okay, so now we're ready to stitch at the edge of the inner edge of our border. And I'm going to leave the corner plain. We might want to do something different there, but I'm going to come back and I'm again going to drop my needle. I've pressed my seam allowances toward the border so that I can stitch on this lower edge of the seam line as I go around all 4 of the borders. I also stitched in that same spot on the lower edge of the seam when I did the stitching in the ditch down the middle. Now I will want to tell you, one of my quilting friends, Cindy Needham, who does a lot of quilting, is the one who convinced me that we really needed to do the stitching in the ditch to stabilize your whole quilt before you go do anything fancy on your quilt. Now, if she were having you do this, she would tell you to ESS, which means stitch in the ditch on every stinking seam. We aren't going to do that because of the way we're going to quilt this quilt. But if you had multiple blocks in your quilt, you definitely would want to stitch in the ditch around every one of those blocks, and then your quilt is all secure for whatever other kind of quilting that you want to do. So we're going to stitch along this border. Get my needle in. Now this is a little more cumbersome because you can see I'll have to juggle this fabric out here to the edge. In fact, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring it up here and kind of butterfly it. Now I have better control, don't I? Okay, I have one border all sewn, and now I'm just going to turn the corner and I'm going to continue sewing all the way around exactly the same way. And we're going to take a short word from our sponsors, and when we come back, I'm going to get the other quilt that I've already done a good deal of quilting on and show you how we can quilt this quilt. We'll be back in a minute.
Trust the quality of Coats & Clark threads for all your quilting needs. With over 200 years of commitment to quality, selection, and innovation, Coats & Clark is the thread company trusted for generations.
Scissorman here, founder of Fomori Cutlery. Chances are, if you're watching this, you're a needle artist. And needle artists like yourself from around the world have trusted the Fomori brand as their preferred cutting instruments for the past 20 years. To learn more, go to famcut.com.
All right, now this is the other quilt that I made using this same pattern, and you can see that I've already done a good deal of quilting on this. It isn't finished by any means, but I want to show you what I did and what I included for you in the pattern, and that is that we would stitch 1/4 of an inch on either side of all of the lines of stitching. So you can see I've stitched on both sides there. You know, when you do quilting, if you make one stitch, you end up with a valley. For it really to show up, you need the valley, the hill, and another valley, which really makes that quilting stand out a lot better. And the other thing that I did after I finished all the in the ditch quilting, I went back and I secured my border edges by stitching in the ditch between the two colors all the way around. And so now you can see all of the pins are gone except the ones in the corners, and I just do that to make sure that I don't pull those loose and get those out of whack, because we'll want to have good square corners on our quilt. You're certainly welcome to quilt your quilt any way that you desire. I always hate that quilt is desired. On a quilt like this, we really want the design to show up, so I don't think it needs a lot of fussy quilting. And in fact, if you wanted more quilting, you could come back and you could add another 1/4 of an inch from the stitching that you've already done. And you can see how that would really make the shapes of these different pieces really stand out. Okay, so then once you have that all done, you're going to trim up the edges of your quilt and put your binding on. We'll put a link in the description of the class to send you to the binding. I did a real extensive binding lesson in the 9-patch class. We'll put that link in there so that you can go check that out if you don't know how to put a binding on a quilt or you just want a refresher. And that's really, once we get the binding on, our quilt is all finished. And you don't want to forget to put a label on the back. Now, I brought some other things to show you. You know, I told you that because of our diagonal seam on the half square triangles, you create a lot of motion in a quilt. And this started out as 2 10-inch squares. The 10-inch squares, some people call them layer cakes. They have other names for those now. But I took 2 10-inch squares and I did just like we did with our small half square triangles, is I drew a line from corner to corner and sewed 1/4 of an inch on both sides of that drawn line. All right, well, so now if you want to be a real smarty pants, I'm going to show you how you can do a disappearing half square triangle. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut 2 inches off of all sides of this block. I'm going to turn my ruler around. That's the side that has a 1/2 inch on it. One more cut. Okay, so let's just take some of these pieces and switch them around. And now you can sew it back together and you have a brand new block. Now, you could have more fun with this, because what would happen if you cut 2.5 inch slices off of every side? You know what? This is you making a new block. Start with the big 10-inch squares, make 2 half square triangles, flip the light and dark around, and make your own block. Okay, so that's one thing that you can do that's different. Now, I teach a class that's called the Exquisite Scrap Class. And in this particular class, do you see how I've turned my blocks all around to make the direction that your eye goes on the quilt completely? It just goes all over the quilt. Well, I want you to see what this starts with, because this is nothing more than a 9-patch block sewn with lights and darks, lights and mediums and darks. And so once you make all of those blocks, a lot of times when I'm cutting my fabric, I will cut 4-inch squares and just pile them up. Then I'll go along and I'll sort them into lights and mediums and darks. And then I can sit down and in an afternoon you can sew a whole quilt just like this one. Well, I hope that you've picked up some tips on how to make half square triangles, 1/4 square triangles, flying geese, a variety of techniques to do those things, and then how we assembled them and put them into our quilt. Of course, you get to choose the fabrics, and there's probably not a single type of a piece of a block that has more motion in it than a half square triangle does. So before we leave today, I just want to encourage you again to go register for the free prizes from our sponsors. We have a wonderful sewing machine tote from Bernina, Coats & Clark, 2 different boxes of thread, the lamp that I've been using here on this set, and 2 other lamps. This lamp is a $425 lamp. Then they're giving their slimline lamp and also their halo, which has a magnifier on it, 3 different lamps. The five $100 gift certificates from Famori Cutlery. If you don't have those batting scissors or their new rotary blade, that would be a good thing to buy with that. We have off-the-wall quilt with their custom rulers, with their rotating mats, and the ruler magic. They also have design walls, and I believe somebody's going to win a design wall of the rotating mat set. And Tracy's tables with the wonderful cutting table that has 2 big leaves that open up to make it so that you can cut and then put that table, the leaves down, put the leaves down, store the table away. So with that, I hope that you'll post pictures of your quilt on the AQS online Facebook page. And whatever you do, don't forget to subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube. Just hit the subscribe button, and every time we post a new video, you will get a notice to let you know there's something new out there from AQS. So with that, we hope you all will stay well, and we can't wait to see you at some upcoming AQS Quilt Week events. And always, if you have any ideas for some classes you'd like for us to have on this series, be sure to drop us a note on our Facebook page, or you can send it to me personally, bonnie.browning@americanquilter.com. And we want to make sure that we're providing the education materials that you're looking for. We'll see you again at our next AQS Let's Quilt class, and everybody stay well out there.